I was asked to give a sunflower disease update on Phomopsis and rust, so two pretty important diseases. And I'm going to show you some pretty intense Phomopsis data here that's really very new. And a lot of this information comes from projects over the last couple of years that have been led by Dr. Femina Matthews. So she was at NDSU for many years, and she just joined NDSU within the last 6 months. And then there's some others that have played a role in this as well. So we'll start with Phomopsis. I think it's important to talk a little bit about how this works and then talk about what's happened in the last couple decades, because Phomopsis has become a big issue, and we often get questions, how long is this going to be a problem, or is it here to stay? So if you can start with me on the bottom here of this life cycle, right on the bottom where I'm moving my cursor, this pathogen overwinters in North Dakota winters, survives North Dakota winters very well. It overwinters in a couple of ways. It can overwinter in seed, but commonly it's overwintering in debris, and not just necessarily debris of sunflower, but any plant that it can survive on as a saprophyte. So just as a not pathogen, just something chewing on the dead cellulose matter. So when you get enough water, what happens is this debris, or the pathogen in the debris, it will germinate, produce spores, and you get an infection, and the infection occurs in the leaves. So up in this upper left corner of your screen, you can see these little brown areas on the leaf tips. Often the infection comes in through the edges, the hydathodes. So it's a little wetter, and it'll start to work its way through the leaf. And you notice in these little schematics, the leaf is turning black. And it'll go through that petiole, and it'll cause a lesion in the stem where the petiole used to exist, because the petiole will degrade. And of course, that lesion will essentially rot out the center of the plant. It lodges very quickly, and it can also cause wilting if it occurs early enough. And then the cycle repeats. So what you're looking at here in front of you now are two images of the process happening. So you have a leaf where you get this infection starting. You can see it's already necrotic and brown. The lesion itself probably started somewhere around here on the edge, and it moves not super fast, but not super slow either. So it starts to move through that plant, and it'll move through petiole, and it'll cause a lesion. In this case, the petiole right here, the leaf is right here, it was right there. It'll cause that stem lesion, and then it can girdle the stem and rot it out. So that's what this thing looks like. It looks a little different than sclerotinia, which is whiter, creamier, and quite a lot different than phoma, which is just small black lesions. When you get it early, or you have a really sensitive hybrid with a lot of infection, it can take down a crop pretty hard. And that's what we have seen multiple times over the last decade. This is just an image from a colleague of ours, Bob Harvison in Nebraska, partly to illustrate that this disease is not just a North Dakota thing. It's causing problems in South Dakota, Nebraska, northern Minnesota. And what he did was had a trial, and he had some sensitive, and he had some fairly resistant sunflowers, and you can see the dramatic difference in head size. Okay, so I want to go back a little bit in time here to talk about this. To do that, we're going to talk about the NSA survey. So for those of you who don't know, the National Sunflower Association sponsors a survey. They have for over 2 decades. For a long period of time, it was every year. Now it's every other year. And essentially what it is teams of people like myself and Hans and Greg and others. We go out into the field towards harvest, not at harvest, but towards the end of the season. And we assess the crop for everything from diseases and insects to production practices, things like weeds, things like that. And there was a lot of work that was done trying to compile some of this data a few years back. So I'm going to first share with you what we found between 2002 and 2015. And the map here are the locations that the survey occurred by year. So you can see the survey follows the acreage. So the most points are in the Dakotas, fewer points in Texas and the High Plains states. In that period of time, there was over 2,200 fields surveyed, and we surveyed about 1 field for every 10,000 acres, 2 locations in each field, 50 plants total. So we're trying to get a good sense of what's actually happening in the fields. So this is some of the analysis of that survey, and this is specifically related to prevalence of Phomopsis. So prevalence essentially means, is it in the field or not? Do you have it or not? And the axes down here between, or on the bottom, are 2002 to 2015. So this was the first maybe 15-ish, 13-ish years of the survey. And the prevalence is the axis to the left. So it goes 0 to 100%. And what I would ask you to follow with your eyes are a couple lines. So let's start with the blue line. So North Dakota and Minnesota were grouped together, mostly because, you know, the production of sunflowers in Minnesota is fairly close to North Dakota. So it's kind of like one geographic region, at least that's how we considered it. And you can see a consistent increase in the prevalence of Phomopsis by looking at this blue line over time. You know, starting in 2002, 2003, 2004, and 5, up to maybe 2013, 15, somewhere in there. And you can see that it's over double the prevalence of what you're seeing with Phomopsis. It's pretty similar in South Dakota. They actually started out with less, and this is the yellow line. So the prevalence of Phomopsis in South Dakota is very limited. You know, 3 to 4% of the fields you might even have it. But by 2013, 14, 15, you know, you're seeing this in 70% of the fields. So this has definitely been increasing for a while. This is the incidence. So this is a little different. The first one, the prevalence, was how common was it? How many fields had it? The incidence is essentially how severe it is in the field. How many plants are we seeing that actually have this? And you can see it's relatively consistent with a slight upward trend. But I think as a general rule, when you do see it, you might have 20% of the plants, 20 to 30% of the plants in some cases have Phomopsis. So it's been increasing over time. It's becoming much more common in the area, but the incidence itself is stayed relatively common. But when you do get it, you get it. You know, a quarter of the plants are going to have it. Okay, so this is a little old. So what happened in the last time the survey happened? This was 2021. So as you will remember, it was quite dry. So we had a lot less Phomopsis. This thing needs water to get going, as you may remember. And you can see in this table, the states are on the left. The disease prevalence, so how many fields had this as a percent, is in the middle column. And South Dakota, that particular year, North Dakota was probably a little drier. South Dakota was hit with, you know, almost 60% of the fields had Phomopsis. In the notes, you can see that South Dakota, the incidence ranged from 7.5% to 100%. In North Dakota, the incidence ranged from 0 to 95%. And I really want to emphasize that when you get this, you can get it pretty severe. Okay, so this thing is definitely with us, and we've had a dry year or two, so we've seen less than we maybe have in the last previous 3 to 8 years. But this is a problem. As soon as we get wet, this is going to be a big problem again. All right, so there's a few things about management, and then I'm going to dip my toe hard into fungicides here. But the first thing is that if you're at risk for Phomopsis, if you've seen this in the last 3 or 4 or 5 years, again, remembering that it needs water, and we've been relatively dry the last couple of years, you probably really want to think about a hybrid that's less sensitive to Phomopsis. And the seed companies are getting a lot of pretty good internal data on this. They will have a good sense for what hybrids are less sensitive. And I would encourage you to ask that in your conversations with them if you have had Phomopsis problems in the last half decade, because the knowledge is getting better. It is not a silver bullet. There is nothing I would say that this is hardcore resistance and it will survive the attack of 1 or 2 pathogens, which is another issue, but there's no silver bullet, but there is help here. The second thing is crop rotation and weed control. Sunflower growers are really good about longer crop rotations. I mean, many of them are at 4 years. This is really good. You're not going to get much better than that. Just remember, good weed control matters because the pathogen can survive on volunteers and some weeds. Okay, so there's been a lot of questions about fungicides, and we have had good indications in some trials in the past that we could manage this a bit, and then other trials would be a total failure. So we needed to look at this in a different way. And I'm going to tell you that some fungicides can help. I'm going to show you why I'm saying that. They're also not a silver bullet. The optimal timing really strongly appears at R1, okay, so budding. And the fungicides that are QOI or FRAC 11, so strobilurins, they really seem to be the most effective. Okay, so Dr. Fabina Matthew led this work, and she is very good with stats and numbers, far better than I am. So I'm just going to present a lot of the stuff that she's been doing. Over the last maybe 7-8 years, this has been funded. What we're going to show you has been funded by the NSA, the South Dakota Oilseed Council, and part program with the USDA. So the trials were conducted in Minnesota, North Dakota, Nebraska, and South Dakota between 2009 and 2020. So there's 79 trials in here. Okay, so 79 fungicide trials, and we're using meta-analysis to look at all of these things together to try to figure out if we can manage this and how much we can manage it. The trials, there's a little bit of information here about the trials. They're all RCBDs, at least 3 replications. They're all relatively small plot work. There's a mix of confection and susceptible, mix of confection and oilseed, and a mix of susceptible and partly resistant. So there's a lot of different hybrids going on here, different genetics. Seeding rate is pretty normal, and it's natural disease pressure. So none of these were artificially inoculated. Now, we were looking for areas where we knew Phomopsis was a problem, of course, but certainly we didn't see it everywhere. And I want to emphasize that they were not artificially inoculated. So this is natural disease pressure. So it's more representative of what you might see in your field, especially if you've got a little bit of history of Phomopsis. All right, we were looking at timing, and we were looking at these 3 chemistry groups. And I'm going to break this down for you. The application technology that we're using, to be clear, it's all ground. So sometimes it's hand, sometimes it's maybe a high boy or something. There's no aerial applications in here. So that is potentially one limitation of the way we're doing it, because obviously, there's a lot of planes flying around with sunflowers. But we should be able to assess timing, and we should be able to assess chemistry just the same with ground application. To talk about timings first, we looked at 3 different growth stages. So we looked at this kind of V8, V10. We looked at R1, which is budding, and we looked at R5, which is bloom. These were our targets to try to identify what timing was really optimal. Oops, sorry. Okay. So here's some of the data, and I'm going to walk you through this. I don't want to go into a ton of detail, but I will show you what matters and what doesn't. So the first question we're asking is application timing using disease severity index. How does the time impact the amount of disease, which the disease severity index is what we're evaluating. So the way you'd read this is the first component here. Oh, there we go. The first component here is timing. So this is what we're looking at. So the timing is in this column. So V8, R1, R5, independent. So a single application at V8 versus a single application at R1, a single application at R5, and then combinations of those 3. So we're looking at single applications and combinations. This K indicator is the number of observations within the 79 trials that we've got. And some are larger than others simply because some of the trials were focused on maybe R1 or R1 and R5. This particular statistic relates to the amount of impact. In this particular statistic, the 95 confidence interval tells us is it significant or not, and what that means. Is it significantly different than 0? Meaning that all of these stats I'm showing you are these single or double applications compared against the non-treated control, not necessarily one another. They're all assessing, are we making a difference from the non-treated with this application? But the most important thing, and the thing that we need to talk about, is whether there was significant or not. So there's 2 different timings that we see that are significant. So we can confidently say over the course of these trials that a fungicide application at R1 is going to cause a significant difference in the level of Phomopsis from the non-treated control. Whereas V8 and R5, they're not doing it. There's also a significant difference that popped up with R1 and R5, which is not necessarily a surprise. But R1 pops up right away as being the timing that makes a difference for Phomopsis control. This is the exact same setup, but in this case, we're talking about yield. So it's the same question. Do any of these single or combination timings make a difference in yield by managing Phomopsis? and one of them pops up, and it's R1. There's a lot of numbers, a lot of trials here, so the K value is high, so the resolution is also quite good, and it's significantly different. The second part of this is we wanted to look at active ingredients. So are there any chemicals here or chemical combinations that are labeled, and we assessed a bunch of different FRAC groups that can make a difference in Phomopsis control. So here in this column, you're looking at active ingredient, and I left both the scientific and the trade names of these products in here, partly because some of them are generics or have generics like tebuconazole at the bottom. And so we're comparing things that are primarily labeled on sunflower, so Quadris, Endura, Praxor, Veltima, Revitec, Approach, Headline, Folacure in this. Now the FRAC group, which makes a difference since the mode of action is in this. So for example, Quadris is FRAC 11, that's a strobilurin, right? Something like Praxor, it is a 7+11, so it's multiple mode action. Now all the statistics are basically, as I explained in the past, and again, significance is what we're looking at. So the question is, do any of these products over the course of these trials make a difference in Phomopsis control? And 4 of them do, and they all have a strobilurin component. How about against yield? Any of these products working against yield? And the answer is yes. So over the course of these trials and all the data sets, we can pretty confidently show here that the strobilurins are the best. And in this particular case, anything that's got headline is lighting up the most. All right, so an extreme example of these trials, and again, I want to repeat, an extreme example of these trials, you can see headline doing a fantastic job against a non-treated. And it relates mostly to the biology of the pathogen, rainstorms at the right time, a susceptible hybrid, and you get this flush of spores that cause an effect, and the headline applied at a good time or a strobilurin applied at that particular time can prevent it in some of these trials. And this is what we've been seeing. We just hadn't been seeing it consistently. All right, so what does all this mean for Phomopsis? So typically, again, we're looking at 79 different trials over time. The FRAC 11 strobilurins are effective, so statistically effective. Similarly, R1 is the most important timing, that budding phase. Foliar fungicides containing those strobilurins are effective, and what I mean by that is they have reduced, of course, across all these different things, they've reduced the disease severity index by about 35% and caused about a 5% yield difference as a mean. If you take all the headline data at R1, the positive return is about $300 to $300 an acre. And there's a lot of different factors in this. It's related to many things that you might already know, your risk of infection, how sensitive is your hybrid, things like that. Obviously, the price of the chemical and the price of the crop. So what does all this mean for Phomopsis? The first thing is to assess your risk. So think about the last 5 years or so. Have you seen Phomopsis? Are you struggling with it? If we get wet, I would expect that would be the case again. And even if you have a couple optimally timed rainstorms, you can see problems with that. But so think about your risk, where you're at and what you've seen on your farm. And if you have that risk, then you probably want to manage it as many ways as possible. And I will go back to this slide, emphasizing that hybrid selection is really important. The companies are gaining more and more information about Phomopsis. It's not a silver bullet, but they will know what's less sensitive. Fungicides are not a silver bullet either, but if you have risk, it's sensitive, you've got a history, a fungicide application, specifically a FRAC 11 QOI, a headline type product, is going to be the most effective, and it's going to be at R1. And then don't forget weed control and crop rotation. Okay, I'm going to switch really quick to rust. I think I have a few minutes left. So a reminder that rust is a foliar disease. It goes through a pretty complex life cycle. What you end up getting is you get small cinnamon brown spores that show up on leaves. And this is a picture that I took a long time ago. It's a sunflower leaf that's flat facing the sky, and there's a little depression in there. And there's an epidemic in that little depression. And I use this as to show that you don't need rain for rust. What you need is heavy dew or fog, long dew periods. This leaf doesn't really have a lot of rust anywhere else except this depression. That depression was just had enough moisture long enough that it could cause an epidemic. And as a result of this idea, sometimes we see rust epidemics in dry years. And I'm concerned about rust. Okay, eventually what happens is the leaf will dry and crinkle, and you can have pretty significant yield losses. So with rust management, it's similar to Phomopsis in that you want to destroy volunteers and wilds because this thing can survive. Hybrid selection is also important, but because the pathogen has races, it's not a silver bullet. But fungicides are excellent, and we've worked that out pretty well. So the threshold for a fungicide application is about 0.5% to 1% severity at R5. So bloom on the upper 4 fully expanded leaves. So take a look at the sunflower crop at that time, the upper leaves. If you see this much rust, you are definitely at risk, and a fungicide is most likely going to help you. This is about 1% on the leaf itself. All right. So the disease severity and the chemicals, because of time, I'm just going to move to this. So this is a combination of 5 different fungicide trials. The application occurred at R5. This is the evaluation, the severity at R7. So this is a little bit after that. It's after early bloom, it's in mid bloom towards the end of the season. The non-treated control is at the top. So the bigger the bar, the more the disease. And then we have a bunch of single products and some combinations spread up by the DMIs, so the triazoles, the QIs, the strobilurins, and others. And you can see there's a lot of products here that are really quite good at managing rust, in particular, the triazoles and the strobilurins and some of the combinations. And then this is yield. So the combination, again, of 5 trials. And you can see that depending on the chemical you choose, there's a statistical difference of 300 to 500 pounds with a fungicide application. So again, with rust, I would recommend scouting. And if you have it at R5, pulling a trigger on a fungicide is most likely going to help you.